One of the other questions I wanted to bring up, have you seen the new district map for Virginia that's being talked about right now? Obviously, like gerrymandering is something that is happening all over the country in different states. Republicans and Democrats are doing it. I don't want to talk about this in like a partisan way. I want to think about this in more of a representation way.
Mm.
So if you notice, I think it's like 11, 7, 6. They all correlate back into Northern Virginia, and then they stretch almost all the way across the state and all the way down. And I mapped it in 7. It's 3.5 hours from a point up here to down here, and it's the same thing I think with 6 or 8. And I'm just thinking of I was rereading the Federalist Papers, the 50 through 56 over the weekend, and talking about who is supposed to be there. And I'm thinking, like, regardless of Republican or Democrat, if you live down here, you have zero shot of winning this office.
Mhm.
Like, no matter what you are, you have to travel 3.5 hours to get to where all the voters are. And then you're not going to know much about them, but vice versa. The people up here aren't going to know much about you. So obviously, uncapping the House, in my opinion, helps alleviate this because it makes the districts smaller. It makes it harder. It puts the emphasis on representation as opposed to political power. But in the short term, what would you say to an Abigail Spanberger who ran as a moderate, who's signed this bill? You know, you gotta, if you're gonna talk the talk, you're gonna walk the walk. Where do you draw the line of these tit for tat power grabs that are happening across the country right now?
Yeah, look, I think that these maps really help us to think about the character, the nature of representation, because what these maps suggest is an attitude that says what matters about the individual elected here is whether he or she is a Republican or a Democrat. Period. The only thing that they're trying to achieve here is a certain party identification in the member. And when we actually think about the logic of our political system, what needs to matter about that person is that he or she can be representative of the people who elected them, right? And so there needs to be some connection between them. There needs to be some geographic affinity, some cultural affinity. That person needs to be from there in some meaningful way. And when you sort of divide up a state, and Virginia is a diverse state. It's an internally diverse state. Northern Virginia really is quite different from Central Virginia and Southern Virginia. And there's a way, given the number of districts they have, for members to represent that diversity. But if it doesn't matter, if all you care about is the party affiliation of the resulting member of Congress, then you've really lost sight of the purpose of representation in the system. And you've subsumed within the logic of your state's politics a kind of nationalization of a polarized electorate that isn't the right way to think about the purpose of the institution of Congress. I think that argument can have some appeal to voters. It will appeal to politicians like Governor Spanberger if it appeals to voters. I don't know that we can persuade the politicians directly because they have a partisan interest here. But ultimately, you persuade politicians by persuading voters. And I think some of the power of the argument for expanding the House is exactly that it does speak to the logic of how voters think about what they're doing when they choose a representative. They actually want somebody who is accessible to them at some level and who speaks for them in national debates. And that's an argument that really ought to appeal to them. So I think the way that a larger house could help us to think differently about reapportionment, not only in the sense of having more districts in some states, but that the growth of the states would be represented by a growing internal diversity of the state's congressional delegation. Rather than just reapportioning, you actually allow the larger society to be represented in its own terms. I think this is an argument that can speak to voters. And ultimately, it's one of those changes, when you make an argument about changing the budget process in the House, you're basically just talking to members. That's never going to be an election issue. But I think that talking about the nature of representation can be a bigger case than that, and an argument made to the American public, too.
Yeah. It's a little disappointing for me. I met Abigail Spanberger once at a local event in Prince William County at like a business. I'm a small business owner, and she was at an event. And I asked her about uncapping the House. She was a member of Congress at the time, and she knew all about the Permanent Apportionment Act of 1929. So I was really impressed at like, hey, somebody's thinking about this. I'm glad that they know it because a lot of people that I had met prior to that didn't even know about it. And I just think I understand what you're saying. Everybody has a partisan interest in politics. You have a party, you've got to win office. Like there's a game that has to be played in order to get things done. I just think that at some point you have to draw the line and you have to go, well, this isn't what we are. You mentioned it at the top of the show is like, are we really a Republican government anymore if we're not focused on the legislature? And it's like, are you really for the people if you're really drawing or signing off on maps like that? And, I
Yeah.
guess as a citizen of Virginia, maybe I'm just a little disappointed. But I will take your advice and I'll try to use that to make our argument to people that they need to rethink about this. Think about it in terms of like, your personal representation, regardless of your party. Um, but
I I gotta
go
jump
ahead.
in. I
Go
just
ahead.
wanted to for the listeners. So the last amendment that was proposed by Congress and ratified by the states recently was in 1971, and that was the 26th Amendment. And the most recently adopted amendment, as some of you may remember, was actually originally proposed in the Bill of Rights alongside an amendment that would have given us a fundamental right to representation, a ratio. It has been about over 50 years, and it is fascinating to think about how those amendments come kind of every 50 years. And I do think this is something we talk about a lot. You've all the importance of uncapping the House first, because if we get a series of amendments or they try to meddle with the courts, the current Congress, right? You
Hmm.
know that it's just the executive branch really doing that, or the leadership, and the people are not going to have faith, I think, in those types of reforms. And I think it brings me back to the importance of getting this done first, right? For member satisfaction, but also for the people, so that when we do eventually get some amendments, they are reasonable and rational and they serve the national interest.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it makes sense first, and for a number of reasons. I mean, it is a form of constitutional maintenance. It's an argument that can be made to the public. It creates an opportunity for other changes. I think it's naturally cross partisan. And so, in all these ways, it strikes me as a place to begin to think about how to put Congress back at the center of the system.